I'd like to welcome Penny Galbraith to the microphone. Our final keynote speaker is Penny, who is a project manager, builder and access consultant with a career-long interest in accessibility and universal design. Consultancy roles have covered a range of clients and built environment forms. Recently, Penny assisted the Australian Human Rights Commission to build an evidence base in respect of housing policy and standards, as well as delivering accessibility and universal design training in Sri Lanka. Penny is an accredited access consultant and a director for the Centre for Universal Design Australia and subject matter expert on disability for the Australian Building Codes. Strategy, research and futures thinking underpin Penny's work, and Penny will discuss the benefits of universal design in housing. Thank you very much, Penny.
Thank you for having me here today. And thank you to the previous speakers. Now, we've heard obviously about some quite specialised approaches to housing and individual needs. Now, my talk's going to take a completely different take on this, and we're going it's a far more holistic approach to housing generally and how universal design provides benefits, not just in those specialised categories, but actually to all Australians. So I just want to do a little starty with some pictures, and I'm just curious to know what people think of these different images. So we have a picture of kind of homes and love hearts, and then we have a picture of a home with dollars. So the words housing and the word home mean different things to different people. And just have a little think about that, and we'll maybe come back with some questions at the end on that as an idea. So today, just a quick intro, I'm going to cover what is universal design. We're going to have a think about universal design in homes, why universal design is important. We're also going to think about evidence and stats, and then just have a one-slide conclusion. So very, very sort of briefly, a lot of this work came out, 20, 30 years ago, and the idea is that universal design provides a blueprint for maximum inclusion of all people. And then some academics did some work, and they came away with this idea that maybe they should get a better definition. And the classic definition of universal design is that it's the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation and specialised design. And sometimes this classic definition attracts a few myths, and I'm just going to try and dispel a couple of those. So the first one is that universal design is not a euphemism for designing for people with disabilities. It's actually trying to focus on everyone. It's trying to focus on everyone. And the next one is that to the greatest extent possible is this idea that it's not actually a utopian ideal. It's meant to be something that's very practical as well as a conceptual approach. And very much the idea is that we want to provide mainstream goods and services and try and move away from this idea that we have to specially adapt or specially modify poor environments to make them accessible or to remove those barriers. And the last thing is that really design is the emphasis. We're trying to actually apply the smarts and use design to remove barriers so that, we kind of make things suitable for everyone or to as many people as possible. And really, in a nutshell, universal design is a thinking process. It's not a product. It's not something you package and sell. It's how we think about something. And the idea is that we're including by design. So if we're trying to design for as many people as possible, we've actually created inclusion. The idea is to go beyond access compliance. We want it to be convenient and sustainable over time. And again, it's this notion that we want to suit most people at various times during their life and in different life situations. Now, let's just have a look. What does this actually mean? Here's a few photos. So in a home, what might we be looking for? What might be considered universal design? So in one of these photos, we've got a nice level entry into the main house, and then we have a kind of very professionally photographed picture of a door threshold going out to an external area. But is a level threshold. Why do we need steps? Why do we need a threshold that we can trip in and out of? It's about trying to think about creating hallways, corridors, circulation spaces, and doing it intelligently. So we maybe want to try and make the most of our circulation spaces so we avoid narrow corridors. But it's not about trying to be enclosing. It's just about trying to think carefully about what we do and how we design it. Here's some other examples. Again, very different kinds of homes. We've got a photograph where we're showing some tiled floors where we have a level transition, so we don't have that nice step into the bathroom because they couldn't set the floor out properly for the drainage. And then another example, we've got quite a cosy looking home, but what they've done is they've tried to combine the spaces, so they have the kitchen, which flows through into a dining space and then a living space. Again, we've got different examples. We've got perhaps more a modern design with the kind of funky, kind of modern furniture. And then we've got perhaps more of a traditional style kitchen, a sort of dining, sort of home space. I think that the key thing to take away from here is that all of these examples, they're not about one size fits all. It's not about only one design. It's actually about trying to reflect people's individual personalities and tastes. And as you've seen, we've had some ultra-modern, we've had some highly conservative and more traditional styles reflected here. Universal design can also be about thinking about the future. And in this slide, in case you're wondering what on earth that is, that's going, okay, well, in the future, it might be really helpful to put some grab bars in the bathroom. And this is an example of a home which did just that. And they put some structural ply around the bath and in the shower compartment. And what that means is that you then put your tiled finishes on, or whatever finishes you choose. But then in the event that you have a need for grab bars in the future, you can actually put grab bars where you need them rather than having to rely on where the structural studs are. So that can be a really low-cost way to kind of future-proof a home. Other fixtures and features that you might look for in a universally designed home, you could be thinking about lever taps, you might be looking at lever handles, you might look at D-handles on cupboards and drawers, but not necessarily. But these are also things that you can do in an existing home when you have to do maintenance. The tap breaks, you think, oh geez, let's get rid of that, the old sort of crosshead tap, which does my hands in, and I'm just going to put a nice convenient lever in. So sometimes we have to work with what we've got, but maintenance can be a really good time to just adjust a few fixtures and fittings. We also like to think about switches, heights of switches. Where are they? Are they up here? Are they down here? Are they at a logical space? Do I open the door? Is it at the same height as the door handle? So again, it can be about trying to create environments that are intuitive. And another key aspect, which is really good in a universally designed home, is to try and remove these kind of steps and these thresholds. And the shower is no exception to that. It is perfectly possible to create hobless showers without having whole waterproofing dramas. And it can make a huge difference to the accessibility, the safety and the amenity of that space. Circulation in front of the WC is another one. It's one of those really small differences that can make the difference between someone being able to go back to their home or not, because it means that a wide variety of people can access that toilet facility. A couple of other examples, just again, a kitchen. Now, this was done by an architect. He wanted it to be universally designed. He chose not to have handles, but that wasn't a need at his time. But he designed that to suit himself. It's kind of pretty ultra-modern. That could be adapted. A feature in that would be that the floor finishes go underneath the benches, so that if you do at some time need to adjust, perhaps having a knee space underneath, you can pull a cabinet out and you don't have to rip out the entire kitchen and have fixing up the floor. So it's a really small thing, putting a floor finish under some cabinets. I like the laundry here because I've been I have this thing about functionality of spaces. And I mean, how many people have had their head down in the washing bowl, pulling out the towels, and maybe some effing and jeffing because, you know, it's all just too hard. So how this is designed, they've raised the appliances up so that you can open the door. We've kind of minimised the bending, we've minimised the reaching, but it's not a wasted space. They've smartly put a couple of drawers underneath so you can put those, you know, doonas you only need once a year, or the pillows. I'm from Queensland, so you only need them once a year. So again, it's thinking. It's being smart about your design. So when we're thinking about universal design in homes, we're kind of thinking about bending, reaching. Can I reach it? Can I grip it? Can I move? Can I sit? Can I stand? Can I see? Can I hear? So it's actually not that complicated, but it's how we interact when we are in our home environment. So why is universal design important in housing? Well, so this is now getting on to the nature of housing. And when I had my stint with the Australian Human Rights Commission, I was tasked with doing some research to look into housing and how it kind of reached into different policy areas and to think about what the evidence base might be. And what I found was that housing has tentacles in so many different policy areas. It's important we've got our international and domestic commitments, whether it's through the UN CRPD, whether it's through our National Disability Strategy, and at state level we've got a whole bunch of different disability policies, state and planning law and so on. It even reaches into tax reform. We've got productivity reports, affordable housing. We talk about it in smart cities. We talk about it when we get to thinking about the intergenerational reports, looking at our demographic changes. It even gets into national energy productivity. But so often the conversation around housing is literally just thinking about just the house, or whether we're talking about the markets or the rent. But actually housing has this substantive policy reach. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of those themes just to show how it's kind of tied together. So the thing that really stood out to me when I did this research was that housing, unfortunately, has been subject to what I called policy lag. Because in 1992, we had the Disability Discrimination Act, and that was a terrific piece of legislation to try and make some important changes. It took a further 10 years until we kind of grappled this idea of transport and trying to make that accessible and make rules about removing barriers for people getting out and about and using transport. Australia signed the UN CRPD in 2006, so that was again, you know, quite an important milestone. But gosh, it was 19 years from the DDA until we actually thought it might be an idea to be able to get into our public buildings. So we still haven't got to homes. We can hopefully start getting somewhere. We've now got rules about our buildings, public buildings. We see in 2016 the NDIS, and again, this was a bit of a sea change. It's not my area of expertise, but apparently this was the sort of quite an exciting change. Maybe not. I don't know. I defer on that one. But housing, where is housing? Housing actually hasn't featured in this. So why? Why do we not think that housing is important? Why do we not think this should be a key policy item? So I can tell you that there is now a regulatory impact assessment has been instructed, and that is being looked at for potential inclusion in the National Construction Code, and we might see it in 2022. But it's a bit of a shame that that's 30 years after the DDA, and it's by no means over the line. So if you ever get the chance to provide feedback or commentary, please take part in any public consultations in that regard. Coming back to some of this productivity stuff and the intergenerational report in 2015. So this was a report looking ahead for the next 40 years, and this had some really important projections based on the data and stats and very cool things. And what they found was that in Australia, the population is set to increase from about 24 million to nearly 40 million. So that's quite a lot of people. It's also projecting that the number of people aged over 65 is going to perhaps more than double. So again, it's quite big numbers. You know, our population won't have doubled, but our older population will have. And then the funding for residential aged care is also going to have nearly doubled. And it's going to be a whopping projected 1.7% of our GDP. Now that's actually a lot. That's a lot of GDP. So these are kind of some quite big issues that our policymakers have to grapple with. And just taking some of these themes forward. One of the things which comes out of this is that the intergenerational report believes that Australian living standards are primarily contingent upon continually improving our productivity. And that's why we need to take every opportunity to increase participation. And you think, well, where's she going with this? This is a thing about housing. But we need somewhere to have a stable, secure home if we're going to try and increase our participation. And this theme is echoed in the Housing Institute of Australia, something like that, HIA. And in their affordable housing paper, they make this statement, which I think captures it very neatly. They say, every Australian should have access to a home, and that access to shelter is a basic human need and is critical to allow all Australians to participate in society to their full economic and social potential. So this is why housing is actually so important. Now, this was part of their response to some affordable housing topics, and I think we should always talk about and touch on affordable housing because it's such an important area. In my research, what I found very clearly is that what constitutes affordable really very much depends on the household's financial situation, the so-called housing market, and whether you're renting or trying to own a property. Now, the fact is that households experience affordability very differently, and this I thought was summed up very neatly by this chart, which is captured in this notion of a housing continuum, which at one end has, we have homelessness on the left-hand side of the diagram. We then have subsidised housing in the middle, and then we have rentals, followed by the people who are perhaps owner-occupiers, whether owning the property outright or owning through a mortgage. The reason this is important is because so often discussions around housing and affordability kind of get strongly skewed depending on the perspective someone is coming from. So if somebody's saying, oh geez, housing affordability in North Sydney is pretty bad, you know, that's not much comfort to somebody who's perhaps in the supported housing end. Like that's not, so the different perspectives are really important. And again, when we're thinking about homes and housing, and often people say, universal design and housing or accessible housing, it's going to cost too much, it's too difficult. And again, what my research allowed me to do was to get a bit of perspective on some of these frequently used statements. And what came out of some work done by an economics consultancy was that the cost of the new home, about 30% of that's tax. So again, when we're talking about how much does it cost to provide all of these universal design features, well actually I think I only found that it was some ply sheets in the bathroom, but because the rest could be designed out. But actually, let's put this in the perspective of the other costs that make up our homes. And this is where this links back into tax policy, because there's such a large amount of tax that is in the cost of a new home. Now, sustainability is also, in my view, absolutely crucial when we're thinking about homes and how that fits into sort of bigger policy pictures. And a government sustainability report called Your Home, they came up with this quote, which I rather like, that many of the homes we build today will still be in use in 50 or even 100 years' time, when climate change, population growth and resource depletion will have created a very different environment. So we need to make homes that we don't need to tear down every 20 years because they're functionally obsolete. We need to make homes that you don't have to make unreasonable, unnecessary modifications because they were badly designed in the first place. And the government of South Australia, they're very clear that the flexibility or adaptability of a building can be a critical determinant of its ultimate lifespan. So as we become more and more aware of these other wider sustainability issues, we need to actually have good design at the heart of what we're doing so that we don't waste, that we try and build in longer service lives, longevity, flexibility, adaptability. And that's where universal design can really come to the fore. And that's because it creates flexible, adaptable homes and that are unlikely to become functionally obsolete. So in terms of some of these policy issues, the Australian Institute of Architects, as you might imagine, they're quite keen on design, but they say, look, design and problem-solving skills are crucial to issues such as sustainable design, universal access, universal design, amenity, and that they can deliver housing that is affordable in its upfront cost as it is for the lifetime of its occupancy. So universal design really is about thought rather than cost. And for me, if we can try and bring universal design into housing, then we actually can be at the centre of trying to address matters in affordable housing. We can address all of the demographic changes which are going to happen one way or the other. And we can also try and take a more sustainable approach. So just a few bits of evidence and statistics just to sort of round this off. Now, the Australia Bureau of Statistics have vast amounts of data, and we're certainly not going to get into that today, but if anyone has queries, feel free to come and tap me on the shoulder afterwards. They've got a lot of data which can help if you're trying to put together policy arguments or try and put together research and so on. So what they can tell us, they tell us that the average household is 2.6 people and that the average Australian home has 3.1 bedrooms. So why is this important? Well, we'll come to that in just a moment. Now, I don't need you to read this slide. I just need you to look at the blue bar at the bottom, and that's telling us that the most common dwelling structure type in Australia is a separate dwelling. So that's a detached, separate dwelling. So we like our separate homes. So over 70%. And what we see is even the townhouses perhaps add another 12%. So about 83% of all homes are either separate dwellings or townhouses. So we're not very good at the denser housing forms here. They only make up that balance of about 17% of homes. So we don't do denser housing forms very well here. So, and again, I don't need you to read this other than note that the way we own property or the way we use property through either renting it or owning it, separate houses or separate homes are predominantly either owner-occupied through direct ownership or via a mortgage. And what we find is that the higher density housing forms, such as apartments, are very, very predominantly occupied through tenancy. So we do have these differences, and perhaps this is reflective of sort of household size and demographics. One of the really interesting things that came out from the statistics, despite the fact that they like to use a very medical model of disability, which one might not particularly like, it still gives us some data. And so we all know this fact. 18.3% of people in Australia are classified as having a disability or identify with a disability. But the point is that in houses or in homes, we live in a household. So that data isn't much use at all. And so I like to do this comparison here, which when we look at the number of households with and without a disability, we find that number, we get to about 36% of all Australian households contain a person with a disability. So suddenly this is kind of not an issue about a smaller group of the population. This is actually affecting over 1/3 of the households in Australia. But my review of the statistics didn't stop there, because when I was going through it all, I found this idea of that some people have a long-term health condition, and these people, they don't identify with having a disability. And I thought, well, maybe this is double counting, and I don't want to have data which is double counting because that's not okay. And so the reason for this slide, which is deliberately looking like I've gone with my highlighter, is because that's exactly what I did. And what I wanted to show was that in this flowchart, which is direct from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, is that we've got the whole population at that time. We've got a specific band on the left, which is identifying the people with disability. And on the right, we've got this whole group that didn't identify with disability. But if we come down this flowchart, we've got this number of people that identify with a long-term health condition. And that's a whopping 22% of the entire Australian population identify with a long-term health condition. And you might say, well, what does that mean? It could mean back problems, it could mean arthritis, and a range of other issues. So suddenly this, disability, housing, suddenly the numbers are starting to look a little bit different. So if we just think about individuals, we know we've got, let's call it 18% of people identifying with a disability. We have another 22% that have a long-term health condition. So already we have 40% of Australians, that's the entire population, who have got something that's going to affect their day-to-day and something that's going to affect how they interact with their home. That's individuals. When we start thinking about households, the numbers just kind of escalate. And look, I'm happy to say that I think the purple numbers may well have some double ups, and it may well be the maximum, but I think you can see the point. When we think about people living in a household, so the people that are going to benefit from universal design features in housing, it's not just sort of a few kind of people that might have disability. It's actually, there's a very large number of Australians who live in households, and we could be talking about as many as 8 and 10 of Australian households are going to appreciate the benefits of a universally designed home. Now, this is quite a last sort of thought on some of the evidence. That this comes from the United States, and it was carried out a few years ago by Smith, Rayer and Smith. And they came up with this idea that homes have a lifespan too, not in a sustainability kind of way. But they wanted to look at the evidence and go, well, how, over the course of a home's lifetime, what is the chance of it having an occupant that has a disability, and what is the chance of it having a visitor that might have a disability? And they came up with the fact that they reckon that in the lifetime of a home, 60% chance of that home having a person with a disability, but a whopping 91% chance that that home would be visited by somebody with a disability. So again, the benefits of universal design in housing would seem to be quite clear. To me, this all represents an opportunity. This represents an opportunity for us to kind of do things just better. We need to just, think and be smarter about what we do. It's not about spending more money. It's just about thinking about things. So really, I'd like to sort of just put what are the benefits of universal design in housing? So for me, the economic benefits are very, very clear when you look at all of those high-level, impenetrable government policy reports. I mean, it is absolutely clear. The social benefits that flow are absolutely clear. Human rights couldn't be clearer. We could spend hours talking about human rights. If we think of housing as being part of the nation's infrastructure, universal design is going to give us better infrastructure. It's going to be more sustainable, and it's going to help us create resilient communities. And that's absolutely fundamental for all of the things that previous speakers have talked about with connections and relationships, this notion of resilient communities. Just to kind of wrap up, universal design the idea is that it's going to suit most people most of the time. It really requires thought rather than cost. We really need to think about we need to think about the household rather than just individuals, because individuals live in households. There is an awful lot of evidence out there to support the provision of universal design in housing, and I think perhaps most of the barriers are attitudinal rather than and based on reality. The benefits of universal design in housing are far-reaching, and I think we've shown that through the connections with all those wide policy areas. And look, the final message really is that universal design in housing is actually about the people that we love. It's about, it's about mum, dad, it's about the kids, it's about grandma, it's about Uncle Brian, it's, Cousin Bill. It's all about those people that we love. It's our mates from the soccer team. It's, it's all of those things. And universal design in housing is not meant to be a replacement for the things we've talked about, those specialist supports that we need. But if we can actually roll out universal design in housing, it makes the work of those specialist providers and some of those specialist tweaks we might need just that little bit easier. So please bear that in mind if you're a provider of housing. So thank you, and maybe we'll take some questions, but maybe we can start off the questions by saying, does anyone have a thought? What does the word housing mean to them, and what does the word home mean?
I think a home should be a safe place that we can live in and not feel trapped in. I had a message from a lady a few days ago, and now another reminder, that she lives in a public housing house and on the second floor, and the elevator is broken and she can't leave. It's been broken for the last 3 weeks. She can't leave her home. And that is, with universal design, means that everyone can get in and out. It's from the baby in the pram till the elderly.
Yep, thank you.
Before we go into questions, I'd just like to thank you very much to Penny. If you wouldn't mind putting your hands together, Penny. Thank you, Penny.
Louise Bannister. Just wondering, how do we get the message across to all of our developers and builders that this is actually not going to cost them lots of money, because you hear that argument so many times?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that question. So this part of that was the reason I did some of that research with the Australian Human Rights Commission. So I can report back on that. That is where this regulatory impact assessment is currently underway with the Australian Building Codes Board, and we're very hopeful that through that process they will be able to say, look, actually the benefits outweigh the costs, and actually mandate some minimum standards in housing. They will be minimum standards, let's be absolutely clear about that, and I would urge, if there are any developers or housing providers out here, to try and think beyond the minimum, because actually it's about being smarter rather than stubbornly sticking to a minimum. Sometimes if we design things with a bit more thought, it's a bit like sometimes more carers doesn't mean better outcomes. Sometimes it's actually the quality of what we're doing which is more important. So fingers crossed that this regulatory impact assessment process will provide a positive outcome. But again, I would urge anyone, if you have the opportunity to provide feedback when they seek feedback, please do so.
I could also just add that tomorrow morning Penny's having a conversation with some of our town planners and our transport planners. Thank you very much for that in advance, Penny, to show them the way, perhaps. Are there any more questions for Penny? There's just a couple over here. Maybe the gentleman at the back, because he has... Oh, no, you've got the microphone. You go.
Sorry, I just wanted to congratulate you on a very entertaining reveal in your talk. I thought it went very well. And it's just a segue from the previous question. We have the most lazy builders I have ever encountered anywhere in Australia in Canberra. Who...
No, go hard, really.
Who are motivated primarily from profit, and because of the expanding nature of the Australian population and the need for new buildings, they are not held to account. Our planning people are similarly motivated because it's a massive contributor to the economic growth of the ACT. Everything's against you for doing the right thing. Regulation is going to set minimum standards, I acknowledge that, But how do you get it to go beyond that into that wonderful world of common sense?
Look, the starting point in such a cost-driven, competitive construction industry or housing industry, it has to be the benchmark minimum standards. That's the starting point. Hopefully, if that can be got into the 2022 building code, then it would be really, I suggest, we're going to be relying on certain key housing providers, perhaps through some of the government organisations, community providers, to perhaps take a lead in that space. And I know they already are actually, because often they try and sort of set the benchmark at this is what we want to achieve. Through state planning codes, often they do set requirements to achieve a certain standard, but it only has to relate to, say, 10% of the housing in a new development. So I think it's probably going to be little by little. I'm quite new to this, shall we say, fight for accessible housing. The colleagues that I'm involved with, I mean, they've been working on this for, 20, 25 years, maybe longer. So this has been a very tough, long and drawn out, little by little, keep writing the letters, and it's been very hard. So I think the optimum that you're talking about is perhaps quite a way off in reality. But hopefully common sense will prevail, because actually it's just good design and it's a better product. So if you're a housing developer, better product, surely that's got to be worth something. So maybe that'll be the differentiator, if we can sell the fact that it's better product, same money.
I think we have another question just up the back here from the gentleman.
Thank you, Barry. I have a feeling that your universal design has implications for other parts of our community. One in the ACT, we have old buses motoring around the ACT that were designed 20, 30 years ago, and they've made a decision to phase them out in 2022. And I look at them and I think, it's a question of empathy, it's not a question of money, because we're obviously spending a lot of money on areas of transport that look good, but do not really serve the community as a whole. So I just make the point, I think we need, one, empathy, and we need to have universal design applied across the spectrum, not just with housing, which I certainly agree with.
Thank you. I think that's a very valid point, and I think some areas are taking this on board very, very seriously. I've been involved with some work with the City of Greater Geelong and was privileged to be asked to be involved in some of their master planning, because they were passionate about wanting to include universal design principles throughout their sort of $1 billion sort of 10-year master plan to upgrade the area. So I think it is out there. I think it is perhaps very dependent on individual governments, whether it's the local city government, the local council, whether it's the state government. So it is happening, but it's patchy. But there are some good examples in Australia.
If I could just flag, so Transport Canberra and City Services will be part of the conversation tomorrow morning. I might actually draw a line there, folks, because the room is quite warm, and I'm mindful that a couple of folks are heading off because it's a bit warm for them. If we could put our hands together and thank Penny very much.